Greetings. In the last mini lecture, I talked a bit about the labor victory of 1945, which was revolutionary in some way. We see the creation of the modern welfare state, and as I pointed out, the labor victory didn't last very long. They were only in power for 6 years, and yet that cornerstone of the welfare state continues. The National Health Service continues. Their privatization efforts were reversed, but the welfare state wasn't, and largely for those reasons of pluralistic stagnation that I talked about earlier. So Labor is defeated in the 1951 election, and the Conservatives essentially take over the government in Britain for a decade and a half. And as your notes point out, during this era, the Conservatives at first incrementally began dismantling the nationalization of industry. They started out by privatizing iron, steel, and long-distance truck driving, but left other industries nationalized. These conservatives in the 50s and 60s demonstrated what I mentioned last time, a bipartisan consensus of the welfare state. They even significantly increased spending on the National Health Service, on public housing, on education, and various welfare services. Essentially, both political parties agreed that there was a national consensus that state-centered solutions were needed to solve national problems. And one of the very popular sayings in Britain, I put in parentheses for you, the saying that labor gave us free teeth and the conservatives didn't pull them out. In other words, both parties were committed to the welfare state. Their big division was over whether industry should be privatized or not, with labor overwhelmingly in favor of nationalization of industry, and the Conservative Party in favor of privatization. Labor had a minor victory in 1964, but once again, the Conservatives made a comeback in 1970. And in the 1970s, the Conservatives began a harder line that, yes, we are committed to the essentials of the welfare state, but it's too costly. We need to be more fiscally prudent, more fiscally sound, and we are going to scale back the more costly programs. A devastating strike hit Britain's coal sector in 1972. The Prime Minister, Mr. Heath, tried to get the TUC and CBI, remember the trade union congresses and the Confederation of Business Industry, told you that the two best known interest groups in this case. The unions rebuffed the offers, and it kind of fell apart, and labor again took over in the 1970s, but they were highly divided. We began to see what Ruskin called the divide in the Labor Party between the labor left, which was the old nationalization of industry and significant welfare state, the labor left, traditional and faithful to economic socialism, including the nationalization of major industries, generous welfare payments to the poor, paid for by high taxes on the affluent and businesses. The moderate wing of the party, the so-called labor right, that would be Tony Blair's party, we talk about him in a little bit, wanted to continue the commitment to the welfare state. However, they agreed with the conservatives that government spending did need limitations, that budget deficits were skyrocketing, and the country could not afford that generous a welfare state. The labor right also was very supportive of U.S. defense policies during the Cold War, wanting increased defense spending to counter what was perceived as a Soviet threat during the Cold War. And of course, this era ended with the House of Commons casting a no-confidence vote against Prime Minister Callaghan, ushering in the era of Margaret Thatcher. And this is an intriguing one because of all prime ministers in the last, certainly in my lifetime, politically, there is no question that Margaret Thatcher is the most successful conservative prime minister of the last 100 years. She is the only conservative prime minister to win 3 consecutive elections. She fundamentally changes the Conservative Party. Unlike earlier conservatives, Mrs. Thatcher refused to exalt the state as the mainstay of the British economy and instead favored the private sector as the motor force of job creation. She believed that no government should step in and overturn the rules of the marketplace. So Mrs. Thatcher vowed to cut back the soaring costs of the welfare state by attacking what she called, and this was a quote from Mrs. Thatcher, the culture of dependency. She called for privatizing all nationalized industries, promoting an enterprise culture, and backing away from the commitment to the welfare state. Most importantly, like Ronald Reagan, Mrs. Thatcher embraced the concept of monetarism. That would be Milton Friedman's notion that control of the money supply is the most important factor in economic policy. And Mrs. Thatcher, like Ronald Reagan, perceived inflation to be the greatest threat to the national economic health and not unemployment. Now, Roskin claims that when I ask you on the exam, according to Roskin, what was the Thatcher of Margaret Thatcher? And Roskin claims that her legacy is mixed, but generally positive. And certainly, if you buy her assumption that inflation is the greatest economic evil, I think that you can make that argument. I am much more concerned with unemployment. So I think if I were looking at the Thatcher record and I were writing this chapter, I would say that her legacy is mixed, but generally negative. Neither is right or wrong, but we're looking at different things. So certainly, as you can see in the notes, the control of inflation is probably her greatest success. Britain's inflation rate dipped from 21% all the way down to 2.5%, and then it came up to 3 or 4% at the end of her term. There was modest economic growth instead of the recessions of the 1970s. There was about a 2% a year increase in GDP, which is okay. It's not great, but it's certainly not bad. From Mrs. Thatcher's perspective, I think she would be proud of battling the unions. When she became prime minister, about 50% of the workforce was unionized. Today, it's about 25%, and I would consider that a negative. I think that labor unions are very, very successful in promoting a middle class. From a political perspective, Mrs. Thatcher drove a wedge in the Labor Party, a wedge so bad that, as Roskin points out, and you should know this, that in the early 1980s, the moderate wing of the Labor Party defected and formed the Social Democrats that quickly relabeled themselves the Liberal Democrats. You can say good or bad. More than 25 state-run businesses were sold and privatized, including British Petroleum, British Airways, Jaguar, Rolls-Royce, and British Telecom. Certainly from a conservative point of view, that would be a success. Failures would include an unemployment rate that increased, and to me, the greatest failure was a significant increase in income inequality, and Roskin, I don't think, emphasizes that enough. Now, what's interesting is that while Mrs. Thatcher did privatize those state-owned businesses, you will notice in the last bullet point, if you will, that state spending rose during her tenure. It rose with unemployment insurance, pension funds increased, welfare and defense spending all increased. And so the welfare state, even though she railed against it, she actually spent more money in those sectors, which I think reinforces that point of pluralistic stagnation. I've got about 4.5 minutes left, and I'm going to just say a few things about Tony Blair here because I'm going to try to end with this mini lecture. Tony Blair was certainly not a typical labor leader. He looks like he should have been a conservative leader. His father was a lawyer, a university lecturer. His father was actually a conservative party activist. Blair went to public schools, remember those private boarding schools? He attended Oxford University, as Margaret Thatcher had. I pointed out, I thought it was interesting, he was the lead singer of a rock and roll band. And Blair takes a moderate approach, one that's between welfarism and conservatism, in between socialism and anti-governmental Thatcherism. Blair represents what Ruskin calls the labor right, and Blair moved his party to the center just as Bill Clinton moved the Democratic Party to the center in the United States during the early 1990s. And when Tony Blair was running for office, he actually had his people shadow the Clinton people when Clinton ran for the presidency and got a lot of advice. And so it's intriguing that Blair, who is a huge fan of America, Blair actually wanted to modify British political institutions. Your book doesn't talk about this, but Blair actually wanted a Supreme Court with significant powers. He wanted to make the House of Lords a more meaningful upper house, much like the U.S. Senate, and even talked about things like maybe we should have a written constitution like the United States. And of course, even though Blair is the most successful Labor prime minister, like Mrs. Thatcher, who won 3 consecutive elections, so too did Tony Blair. He was able to lead the Labor Party to 3 consecutive victories. Now, what's interesting, and this goes back to collective responsibility that I talked about earlier, his chief critic in the Labor Party was Gordon Brown. And notice what I talked about earlier, that sometimes prime ministers engage in co-optation, right? You bring a critic into your cabinet and you silence him. And that's what happened here. In fact, Gordon Brown was given the second most powerful position in the British government, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, overseeing the most powerful and important cabinet ministry. And one of the questions that I put on the exam is, what is the most powerful cabinet ministry? And there's a box in it in your chapter talking about that, the Treasury Department. So what is the most powerful agency in Britain? It's the Treasury Department. And interestingly, Blair gave Brown considerable latitude to run the agency as he saw fit. And Blair's loyalty, in this case, working with Tony Blair, paid off, because when Blair resigned, Gordon Brown ended up becoming the new prime minister. So we have concluded. We have concluded Great Britain finally. So I wish all of you great luck on your first exam. We'll have a Scantron exam, and then we will move into a very different country, a very interesting country. We will move to France. Hope you have a wonderful rest of the week. Take care. Bye-bye.